Ernst Cassirer writes in his essay on man, the beginning of chapter 8 on language, quote, "Language and myth are near of kin. In the early stages of human culture, their relation is so close and their cooperation so obvious that it is almost impossible to separate the one from the other. They are two different shoots from the same root. Whenever we find man, we find him in possession of the faculty of speech and under the influence of the myth-making function." End quote. In the 20th century, analytic philosophy undertakes what is called the linguistic turn, at the center of which is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's maneuver is to understand philosophy itself through language, and thus shifting the understanding of what philosophy is doing from previous conceptions rooted in metaphysics or even axiology to a conception defined, at least by later Wittgenstein, as a language game. Philosophy becomes a corrective, useful for clarifying concepts and avoiding confusion, but unable to produce anything in the way of a normative ethical claim or an ontological truth. That is simply not what language is equipped to do. Rather, language embodies a form of life and facilitates the various group activities that human beings participate in. While we tend to focus on the analytic tradition when thinking about the linguistic turn, today we're going to talk about a philosopher who writes and works in the continental tradition and thinks, we might say, in parallel with the linguistic turn. Ernst Cassirer also makes language central to his philosophical project, but in a very different way than Wittgenstein. Language is, for him, one of the definitive symbolic activities of mankind. And Cassirer understands mankind as the symbolizing animal. Arguably, Cassirer's approach is more empirical than Wittgenstein's approach. He operates fundamentally as a logician or as a grammarian, perhaps even at times as a mystic or as an intuitive thinker. But Cassirer wants to understand how it is that language could come about, and pose this as an empirical question, as an anthropological question. He wants to understand how it works. And in this way, whereas Wittgenstein wants to understand philosophy through language, Cassirer is trying to understand language through philosophy. In my opinion, Cassirer is a criminally underrated philosopher. He's one of my favorite philosophers from the early 20th century, and today we're going to take a look at a long essay, or a short book of his, about 100 pages, entitled Language and Myth, as well as some of the material on language and myth from his essay on man. But the book, Language and Myth, it was one of those philosophy books that I bought on a whim from a used bookstore so many years ago. I read it while I was on tour, and it had a profound impact on me. I ended up citing the book. I included some discussion of its ideas in my own book, The Ritual Madness of Rock and Roll, so I'm very happy to finally devote an episode to Cassirer's ideas, which seems appropriate after recently having discussed Wittgenstein. And in the next episode, we're going to attempt a kind of synthesis of the three of the main figures who have influenced me in thinking about language, who are Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, and Cassirer, and see what emerges when their theories interact. Before we get into Cassirer's ideas, however, let's talk for a moment about his life, a little bit about his philosophical background, and just the perspective with which he approaches language and myth. Ernst Cassirer was born in Silesia in 1874, at the time a province of Prussia. Only 3 years before, Bismarck had established the Prussian Empire, which was declared at the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles as the Second Reich. The First Reich had, of course, been the Holy Roman Empire, which was subdued at the hands of Napoleon and dissolved after its emperor abdicated the throne. The German people have certainly had a tumultuous history in the modern era, and even against that standard, Cassirer lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in German history. Cassirer's family were Bildungsbürgers, a term for the educated middle class. If we'll recall from earlier in the season when we discussed Goethe's Sorrows of Young Werther, his main character Werther is a Bildungsbürger. A Bürger was originally just a name for someone from a German town or city. It's a name for a city person. Eventually, it came to signify a class, the bourgeoisie, effectively. But in contrast to the Besitzbürgertum, who were the property-owning bourgeoisie, the Bildungsbürgers, that specifically referred to the middle class, the middle-class citizen who developed himself through education, through Bildung. This was a growing stratum of society that became educated as a means of furthering their status, often becoming part of the civil service, entering the legal profession, becoming clerks and secretaries for the nobility, and so on. The Cassirer family were German Jews whom, within this social milieu, were largely accepted. Ernst Cassirer studied at the University of Berlin and later at Marburg, mentoring under Hermann Cohen. Cohen was a central figure who helped to renew interest in the Neo-Kantian philosophy. As with many Neo-Kantians, the philosophy of science was central to Cohen's focus. Cassirer would remain forever indebted to Cohen for this philosophical grounding, so to speak. Throughout Cassirer's work, there's that commitment to empiricism that I mentioned. Cassirer is not content to let his theorizing sort of wander aimlessly, untethered from the natural sciences, but in the words of Peter Gordon in his introduction to Cassirer's essay on man, quote, Cassirer's general style of mind was synthetic and ecumenical. He discerned connections across different domains of philosophy and never felt himself confined to a single subfield of the discipline. In the 1920s, his restless intellect drew him into the circle of art historians and humanists around Abbey Warburg, whose remarkable Library of Cultural History in Hamburg became an institutional home for Cassirer and an inspiration for his turn toward a philosophy of culture. End quote. Cassirer is a remarkable figure because his philosophy brings science and culture together at a time when the sciences and humanities were seen as drifting apart. What I mean by this is that in the early 20th century, analytic philosophy, particularly the logical positivists, were attempting to bring philosophy into accord with the rigor of science and reimagining philosophy as a way of clarifying concepts for the scientist. Continental philosophy, which was traditionally more inclusive of insights from, say, both literature and the sciences, seemed to be running out of juice. C.P. Snow, in a very famous lecture from 1959, would later reflect on the trends that were building during the early decades of the 20th century as he saw them, in which the traditionally holistic understanding of what constituted an intellectual had become split into what he called two cultures. While the Bildungsbürgers of the 19th century would have looked to the model of a man like Goethe or Leibniz as an homo universale, a universal man who didn't divide up his intellectual life, but pursued different disciplines and subfields and tried to think across them and bridge the gaps between them. The polymath was the ideal. The Renaissance man is the ideal. And this aspirational vision of the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, the argument would be that this type was slowly going extinct in the face of the increasing specialization of academics. The model of the Renaissance man was, by the 1920s, somewhat quaint. Now, in light of this admittedly very broad and perhaps overgeneralized account of the overall mood of the era as regards knowledge, Cassirer appears against this as a figure from an earlier time. He's an old-style polymath. He's a universal thinker. His erudition is wide-ranging. He knows no disciplinary boundaries. His association with humanism is apropos to that description because we find the beginnings of humanism also in the Renaissance. Cassirer is one of the last great humanists. He's an inheritor of the Enlightenment tradition. He attempts once again to be a universal thinker, or I wouldn't even say attempts. He is. That's in his nature. He takes it upon himself to continue and defend these traditions. Cassirer published The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms in 3 volumes from 1923 to 29. It was a monumental work in which Cassirer presented mankind as animale symbolicum. Our defining feature as human beings is the fact that we create a symbolic world. This is the core idea of the philosophy of symbolic forms, but this foundational claim would also be central to Cassirer's most accessible work, An Essay on Man, which he published a year before he died in 1944. Working from this Neo-Kantian framework, Cassirer treats this capacity for symbolic thinking as the necessary process by which reality can be cognized. The symbol is not a falsification of the world, nor a misapprehension, but rather it is the essentially human activity to think in symbols, and that's actually what raises us above the world of nature and into this human symbolic world, by means of which we can gain the capacity to even think objectively and rationally. Quite in accord with Kant's Copernican revolution, Cassirer does not measure the the validity or the worthwhileness or the value of the symbolic world to approximate an external world which it is supposed to represent, that exists independently of it. Rather, as he says in Language and Myth, quote, "We must find in these forms themselves the measure and criterion for their truth and intrinsic meaning. The special symbolic forms are not imitations, but organs of reality, since it is solely by their agency that anything real becomes an object for intellectual apprehension, and as such is made visible to us. The question as to what reality is, apart from these forms, and what are its independent attributes, becomes irrelevant here." End quote. A distinctly Kantian attitude. But Cassirer is not stuck on Kant. He takes in much of the German tradition, bringing in insights from Herder as well as from Hegel, or for that matter from Goethe. While some saw Cassirer's work as sort of a relic of an out-of-date tradition, Cassirer nevertheless incorporates very modern aspects of what was going on in philosophy at the time, right? The historical turn in philosophy, the linguistic turn, as we've already mentioned, because he sees the symbolic world as something that develops. It's not merely these static categories or something like this, but the symbolic world changes. It's grounded in history. And he sees linguistic thinking as symbolic thinking, and therefore as a verdant field of inquiry for understanding man's symbolizing activities. But really, for Cassirer, we find the symbol in the activity of symbolizing in basically all the great endeavors of mankind. The arts, the sciences, in myth and religion. Without the symbol, there would be very little left of human life. Indeed, we could say all the aspects which are distinctly human would be gone. In 1929, the same year that Cassirer finished his philosophy of symbolic forms, he had an infamous debate with German philosopher Martin Heidegger. That spring, the two met for a public conversation at Davos, Switzerland. This debate came to be viewed as holding a kind of emblematic significance regarding the direction that philosophy was taking in the early 20th century. Emmanuel Levinas, who was a student at the time, said of the debate, quote, "A young student might have had the impression that he was witnessing the creation and the end of the world." End quote. What he meant by this is that the much older Cassirer appeared as the representative of a dying order, an out-of-date Weltanschauung. His world, we could say, was dying, and Heidegger's world was being born. Peter Gordon also wrote a book on the debate between these two men entitled Continental Divide, and he says that it was a clash between two different, quote, normative images of humanity, end quote. That is to say that both had conflicting visions of human life, which may seem at the outset to be merely abstract, but have profoundly different normative implications. In contrast to the erudite Cassirer, measured and calm in his presentation and appearance, Heidegger appeared as a down-to-earth figure. He spoke with this sense of urgency. He questioned Cassirer's humanism relentlessly. Heidegger's great work, Being in Time, was also newly published, but he had already made a great impact on the philosophical world. We've done a 3-part episode on Heidegger in the previous season, so go check out that episode if you want to know more about that. Although most of those episodes are devoted to his lectures on Nietzsche, and I only talk a little bit about Being in Time. But in any case, Being in Time had attempted to bring philosophy back to the questions of being, back to ontology. And thus, the book fixes its gaze on the finite existence of a human life, thrown into the world, living as a being toward death, and with our every endeavor defined, in some sense, by this looming mortality. To the normative question, what should I do? Gordon writes, quote, Cassirer could provide a ready answer in the form of a universally valid ethical law, whereas with Heidegger, because his thinking extolled finitude in place of universality, there could be no answer besides a normatively vacuous resolve. End quote. Whereas Cassirer believed in a kind of progress, we might call it a developmental view of culture, Heidegger's radical existentialism severs any such possibility, replacing it with an angst to comprehend the meaning of being. It's a question that has existed since time immemorial, and Heidegger essentially claims that we've made no progress on it. Most of Enlightenment philosophy, starting from Descartes, has been a wrong turn. This is why Levinas felt that it was like watching the entire 19th century intellectual world being destroyed, which had built itself up based on these traditions of the Enlightenment and humanism and all of these things. Levinas felt that Heidegger came off looking much better in the debate. The humanism of the Enlightenment was to be a thing of the past, and Gordon summarizes it this way, quote, in the years following Ernst Cassirer's death in April 1945, recollections of the Davos disputation began to solidify into a political allegory. The impression that Heidegger had defeated his opponent, though clearly an exaggeration, came to serve as a condensed and highly affecting personal history that symbolized political events of the years to come. End quote. The fact that this debate was largely taken as symbolic of the philosophical zeitgeist is an irony in and of itself. The symbolical philosopher loses, and it comes to be seen as a symbolic defeat, which in a way proves his point that mankind thinks in terms of symbols, at least. But as Gordon mentions, there was also a political symbolism at play. In a way, Cassirer stands for the classical notions of liberalism, which would soon come under threat, particularly in Germany. When the Nazis came to power, their new laws saw Cassirer expelled from the university system. Cassirer and his wife had to flee for their lives, first to Austria, then to Britain, then to Sweden, eventually to the United States. Heidegger, meanwhile, remained and joined the Nazi Party. Paul Tillich drew a fascinating insight about this. He said that this debate between Cassirer and Heidegger, quote, probably reveals as much about the situation as can be shown. Namely, the conflict between one who, like Cassirer, came from Kantian moral philosophy with rational criteria for thinking and acting, and one who, like Heidegger, defended himself on the notion that there are no such criteria. A year later, Cassirer was in exile, and Heidegger was the rector of Freiburg. End quote. We can read some implications into Tillich's remarks here, that German philosophy had taken on a form that made it unable to rationally critique society or to issue moral injunctions, and this shift would render philosophy impotent and thus, in a way, irrelevant in dealing with the questions of politics and ethics in the 20th century. Whatever we may think of such interpretations, posterity has been more generous to Cassirer than the initial reactions to the debate. His career continued without interruption, by the way. Cassirer taught in the United States at Yale and Columbia for 4 years. He died in 1945. His life thus saw the end of both the Second and the Third Reichs in Germany. While his body of work was impressive in its depth and scope, Cassirer was perhaps easier for the philosophical world to forget than he should have been, given his role as the symbol of the defeated 19th century style of philosophy, the defeated humanist, the last universal man. His legacy that we are left with is not just that of a philosopher, but also as a historian of philosophy who felt that it was of great importance to preserve the traditions of Enlightenment philosophy against the radical and at times anti-intellectual political developments that Germany would witness during the first half of the 20th century. Cassirer can be seen in many ways as, the noble centurion of an intellectual empire that was doomed to fall, who nevertheless carries out his duty with a determined resolve. He bears witness to the end of the old world, the world that died after World War II, not to mention the impact of the atomic bombs on society at large. And that world was arguably completely gone by the time the Cold War was in full swing. Cassirer now speaks to us as the stalwart representative of the wisdom of this bygone age of philosophy. But the topic of this episode doesn't really concern Cassirer's humanism or his Kantianism, although all of the various aspects of his thought are helpful to understand when we approach his work on language. Other than Kant, the main influences on myth and language are Wilhelm von Humboldt, the philosopher and linguist, also Hermann Usener, the philologist who was once a student of the famous art historian Winckelmann. Usener went on to teach many prominent philologists himself, including Friedrich Nietzsche and Aby Warburg, the man who founded the Library for Cultural Studies that Cassirer used as an intellectual home where he had studied and sometimes even delivered lectures. Cassirer also draws inspiration from Herder, who had advanced his own theories on language in the 18th century. Cassirer responds critically to writers such as the philologist Max Müller and the philosopher Herbert Spencer. In the opening section of Myth and Language, Cassirer considers the previous attempts to come to an understanding of language, particularly as it relates to myth. He cites, for example, Max Müller's opinion that myth is, quote, the dark shadow which language throws upon thought, and which can never disappear till language becomes entirely commensurate with thought, which it never will, end quote. As Cassirer puts it, if we follow Müller's view, we will conclude that, quote, the mythical world is essentially a world of illusion, end quote. In the account given in Müller's work, the reason why the Greeks had a myth that Daphne was saved from Apollo's grasp by Mother Earth, who she transforms Daphne into a laurel tree, that can be understood by studying the etymology of the names involved in this story. The name Daphne means laurel in Greek, but traces back to ahana in Sanskrit, which means the redness of dawn. This meant that the Greeks insensibly believed in a kind of logical identification of the laurel with the dawn, and thus we have the myth that comes out of that, because the word meaning dawn eventually transforms, evolves into a word meaning laurel. And so there's this sort of insensible connection drawn between them from this process of words sort of changing and pronunciation shifting, receiving loan words from other cultures, and so on. Quote, the story of Phoebus and Daphne is nothing but a description of what one may observe every day. First, the appearance of the dawnlight in the eastern sky. Then the rising of the sun god who hastens after his bride, then the gradual fading of the red dawn at the touch of the fiery rays, and finally its death or disappearance in the bosom of Mother Earth. End quote. Seems like a reasonable explanation, but Cassirer does not put any stock in this view. The view that, aside from the etymology claims, right, which are largely accurate, he doesn't put any stock of this view of the relation between language and myth, and in fact believes that it misunderstands both activities, because Muller is presenting the myth as if it's a kind of mistake, a kind of illusion created by these linguistic shifts. But Cassirer describes that viewpoint as a form of naive realism, in which language, in a sort of ideal usage, would simply describe the world as it is, but it becomes papered over by confusions that are produced over these long generations, by, again, shifting meanings and cognates adopted from other languages, and so on. And that view implicitly assumes the reality of objects, independently of the language's representation of them, a standpoint from which language looks like a mere imitation of the objects. It's a task to which language can never perfectly measure up, as Muller admits, but one can nevertheless imagine a more ideal use of language and attempt to make their own use of language more commensurate with thought rather than myth. Cassirer also quotes from Muller's work in his chapter on language in an essay on man. It seems he really disagrees with Muller's position, or perhaps more likely he finds it helpful as a polemical target in order to help elucidate his own position. But in any case, he quotes Muller's description that myth is, quote, a disease of language, end quote. And further, quote, a constant source of misunderstandings, many of which have maintained their place in the religion and in the mythology of the ancient world, end quote. Muller's position, by the way, is not new. In Language and Myth, Cassirer references the Platonic dialogue Phaedrus. In his essay on man, he mentions the Cratylus. In both cases, there are etymological discussions in these Platonic dialogues about the origin of certain words in the Greek language as phonetically related to myths. It's almost always a myth or a deity or a hero from the past that the meaning of these words are tied to. In the view of someone like Muller, or Socrates for that matter, a rational approach would look to the things themselves and try to get around the confusion and cluttered meanings of language caused by the shadow or the disease of myth. So that's the naive realist view. But on the other side of the coin from that view, we might say we have a kind of cynicism that can arise, a skeptical attitude towards the ability of mental processes to even grasp reality in any adequate sense. The symbol from this point of view is treated very similarly to how the naive realist treats the symbol, as bearing what Cassirer calls the curse of mediacy, in that all mediating processes obscure as they reveal. They do both. But could this lead one equally to the conclusion that rather than attempting to cure the diseases of language, which would be hopeless in any case, one should acknowledge a kind of total disconnection between the symbolical world of language and the so-called objective world? The total cynicism that this can produce as regards these problems, Cassirer describes as the viewpoint of the quote-unquote modern skeptical critics of language, end quote. Their project leads to, quote, the complete dissolution of any alleged truth content of language, and the realization that this content is nothing but a sort of phantasmagoria of the spirit. Moreover, from this standpoint, not only myth, art, and language, but even theoretical knowledge itself becomes a phantasmagoria. For even knowledge can never produce the true nature of things as they are, but must frame their essence in, quote, concepts. But what are concepts save formulations and creations of thought, which instead of giving us the true forms of objects, show us rather the forms of thought itself, end quote. Now, as you've probably already gathered, Cassirer does not agree with that view either, but let's look at how he counters these. Against Muller's view and its disparagement of myth, Cassirer argues, quote, to regard a fundamental human activity as a mere monstrosity, as a sort of mental disease, can scarcely pass muster as an adequate interpretation of it, end quote. And I would say this is a good rule of thumb in general, not to assume, at least as a first proposition, that something the majority of human beings do, or even in this case, that all human beings do, is necessarily just a product of stupidity, completely worthless and misguided. Usually there's, even if this isn't saying that it's something is validated just by a lot of people doing it or it being old and traditional. That is not what I'm saying, and certainly Nietzsche, most philosophers wouldn't agree with that, except maybe Hume and Pyrrho, maybe a couple others, right? Ironically, the skeptics. But in any case, what I would say is being more careful about assuming there was no reason or no motivation or some kind of advantage or necessity served by whatever it is we're talking about, an institution idea that we see to be broadly incorrect, right? Assuming that there was no reason for it, it was just pure superstition and idiocy is a pretty, it's an inadequate view it's an inadequate lens from which to approach a study of the humankind and our activities. And that's a very commensurate with Nietzsche's approach, by the way. You should ask, what need did this idea fulfill, for example, right? Now, against the skeptical critics of language, Cassirer invokes, as he says, in all seriousness, Kant's Copernican revolution. This is the overcoming of this apparent dichotomy in the understanding of both myth and language. Our conceptions, Cassirer says, are not derived from an objective world that we receive ready-made, so to speak, that exists prior to language, but, quote, they are not mere products of fancy, which vapor off from fixed empirical realistic existence to float above the actual world like a bright mist. The mythical form of conception is not something superadded to certain definite elements of empirical existence. End quote. Reminiscent of Herder, who viewed the language of a given people as their way of seeing the world, and as an expression of their experience of it, Cassirer argues that, quote, any symbolic form of language, art, or myth is a particular way of seeing and carries within itself its particular and proper source of light, end quote. Theoretical science, as Descartes argued, is one such light, a particular way of seeing, which remains the same no matter which object it shines on, whatever it deals with. But the same can be said of a certain mythic conception of the world, or of a given language, and the worldview by which things, events, and experiences of life are named and assigned meaning that's contained within that language. Our modern conception of the world, the symbolical forms that we utilize in order to understand it, quote, do not precede language as a substratum of given fact, but language itself is what initiates such articulations and develops them in its own sphere. Then it turns out that language could not begin with any phase of noun concepts or verb concepts, but is the very agency that produces the distinction between these forms, that introduces the great spiritual crisis in which the permanent is opposed to the transient, and being is made contrary to becoming, end quote. And that point strikes me as very Wittgensteinian or very Nietzschean in a certain sense, that it is an artifact of our language that we oppose transitoriness to permanence and come to this whole philosophical crisis of being and becoming. That's something that happens within the linguistic game that we're playing, so to speak, which doesn't mean that it's totally fake, not real. That's the view that Cassirer has been arguing against. But it's simply that we can't conceive of such a dichotomy or such a challenge or a problem outside of these linguistic conceptual categories that we've created, which are the very organs by which we understand reality. It's within that symbolical world that the contradiction between being and becoming becomes a problem. It's here that the work of Hermann Usener becomes of great importance, and Cassirer will cite his work at least as much as anyone else in myth and language, probably more than anyone else. And through Usener, we can see how Cassirer, having hewn pretty closely to the traditional Kantian lines in his analysis, brings the Kantian view into a historicized form. He makes it historical, right? Cassirer says that the philosophers, unspecified exactly who he means, but we can guess at his meaning here. The philosophers have given us a view of the human mind as endowed from the beginning with logical categories. After Darwin, such a view must be amended, and Usener gives voice to this in his essay toward a science of religious conception. Usener writes, quote, There have been long periods in mental evolution when the human mind was slowly laboring toward thought and conception and was following quite different laws of ideation and speech. Our epistemology will not have any real foundation until philology and mythology have revealed the processes of involuntary and unconscious conception. The chasm between specific perception and general concepts is far greater than our academic notions, and a language that does our thinking for us lead us to suppose. It is so great that I cannot imagine how it could have been bridged, had not language itself, without man's conscious awareness, prepared and induced the process. It is language that causes the multitude of causal individual expressions to yield up one, which extends its denotation over more and more special cases, until it comes to denote them all, and assumes the power of expressing a class concept. End quote. Cassirer says that the question of how to address this problem, outlined by Usener in his work, will be the guide of his inquiry in Language and Myth. He says he shall take it up exactly in the form that Usener gives it. How is it that man, through language, managed to bridge the chasm between specific perceptions, specific experiences, specific phenomenon, these particular cases, and the general category, the concept? He articulates the same question in another form in the chapter on language in his essay on man. He addresses the problem in that chapter when he responds to the work of the linguist Otto Jespersen. Cassirer writes, quote, "According to this theory, a transformation took place when human utterances, which at first were nothing but emotional cries, or perhaps musical phrases, were used as names. What originally had been a jumble of meaningless sounds became in this manner suddenly an instrument of thought. For instance, a combination of sounds sung to a certain melody and employed in a chant of triumph over a defeated and slain foe could be changed into a proper name for that peculiar event, or even for the man who slew the enemy, and the development could now proceed by a metaphorical transference of the expression to similar situations. It is, however, precisely this, quote, metaphorical transference which contains our whole problem in a nutshell. Such a transference means that sound utterances, which hitherto had been mere outcries, involuntary discharges of strong emotions, were performing an entirely new task. They were being used as symbols, conveying a definite meaning." End quote. So here again, this is the chasm that Usener says is so vast he can't even imagine how it could have been bridged. It may seem like an explanation to say, this is how language developed concepts through this metaphorical transference. But that metaphorical transference is a giant leap, right? It's simply, to put it in those terms, is simply to reformulate the problem in different language. The problem essentially is how language comes to signify what it itself is not. How a sound complex stands for an image. The idea of one thing standing for something else is a huge leap, which seems to make possible the entire world of conceptualization. And thus, when we try to conceive how it could have happened, we run up against a wall. And Cassirer goes on to say in Essay on Man that what we require in our analysis cannot simply be empirical studies or historical analysis, though we certainly need that as a basis. We also require that Platonic ability to inquire about the essence, about the conceptual unity of phenomena within becoming. If we want to reach an understanding anyway, we will need that. Again, this is not a suggestion that there's a real reality of objects behind the world that we perceive, something like that, but that the very act of perceiving is synonymous with this grasping of a conceptual unity of some kind. And Goethe's theory of the Urphänomen will be very useful to remember here. You can go back to the finale episodes of the previous season in which we talk about this concept, mainly in part 1. To give a short explanation here, Goethe believes that when we perceive a phenomenon, we directly apprehend a concept, an idea, not just the sense data. That we perceive through these conceptual unities, and therefore one can, quote-unquote, see an idea And in fact, that is all we see is ideas in some sense, or that's primarily what we see. And the individual, constituent qualities of the various five senses that make up the object, that unity, are sort of secondary things that we perceive. But in any case, we need both. We need a scientific understanding, we need an anthropological understanding, but we also need to come to some kind of explanatory conception of what the unity of language is. And that's not to be a unity of substance. It's what Cassirer calls here a functional unity. Within any comparative study of languages, we will find a vast variety of means, but our question must be attuned to the ends. And through this, we can come to an understanding of the multiplicity of linguistic forms. But if we take note of where we are in this inquiry so far, at this point, we have taken what is generally considered to be perhaps the most basic linguistic process, really, the act of giving a name to something, and we've made that operation appear problematic in and of itself. Language seems even more mysterious than before, because even to give a name to a person or an event, not to speak of an abstract concept, suggests that great leap. We move from a use of language that we would have no problem attributing to animals, like cries of pain or noises of excitement, if we can indeed call that a language, which it very well could be. But we're moving now to that uniquely human activity of creating symbols. The name is a symbol in sonic form. The more complex grammatical operations of language, however we are to explain them, those seem far easier to derive or to predict once we have that naming process, after the inception of the naming process. Those are much more easier to, I guess I would say, is like getting to the process of naming. That's the difficult thing. Once we have that, it's pretty easy to derive all the rest of language, right? Or maybe not pretty easy, but it's far easier. And so we're trying to get down to the bedrock, right? A symbolizing process from the mere act of making sounds. This metaphorical transference is not merely an aspect of language, it's a prerequisite of language. It's the foundation of language. We might say that language only begins at the point of this transference. If we turn then to myth, we will immediately notice that almost all of the great creation myths of the world's ancient religions attribute the creation of the world to an act of naming, whether in India or Egypt or even in Christianity and Judaism. Quote, in all mythical cosmogonies, as far back as they can be traced, this supreme position of the word is found. Among the texts which Preuss has collected among the Uitoto Indians, there is one which he had adduced as a direct parallel to the opening passage of St. John, and which, in his translation, certainly seems to fall in with it perfectly. In the beginning, it says, the Word gave the Father his origin. End quote. Certainly a very striking similarity, but the point for Cassirer is not the similarity in content, but recognition of a common form to all of these examples of word veneration in our ancient mythologies. There is this sense that the word has immense power, that in all of these myths. But there is a mystification as regards where we got this power. It seemingly can only be explained as a gift from the divine. For example, in the story of Genesis, that's a story in which man is given the dictate to name everything, right? So God doesn't give everything in the garden its name. He delegates that task to Adam, to mankind. As a being created in God's image, he is able to partake of this divine power of the word. And the idea of the divine power of the word relates us back to that earlier question. In what relation does language stand to myth? Insofar as it seems that in the mythological conception of naming, another ubiquitous theme is that notion that the name is what is named. The name somehow is the same as what the thing really is. Quote, the name does not merely denote, but actually is the essence of the object. The potency of the real thing is contained in the name, end quote. And so, for example, we have this notion of gods with many names. By taking on so many names, they actually possess that many attributes or powers. Marduk, one of the oldest deities, acquires kingship over all the gods. He devours his enemy gods, and he takes their names by that same token, having consumed them and gained their power. The goddess Isis is called the 10,000 named, or the Mirionyma. In the Quran, Allah can be called by 100 names in one's prayers. And there is also this notion, in many myths and stories, of gaining power over someone or something by learning and using its true names. There's this idea also of secret names, the name that everyone knows versus the true name that's kept a secret, for if anyone were to learn it, you could use that name to control them in some way. If we recall from the dialectic of Enlightenment, there the argument is that already within myth there is this prototypical form of what we would call enlightenment, in the sense of progress towards a rational view of the world. And one of the elements of mythology that takes us a step in that direction is the mythological account of why things are named the way that they are, and the narratives and stories explaining the names of things. To us moderns, with a scientific, mechanistic mindset, these mythological stories might seem as though they're rather hazy, superstitious accounts of the world. But we can nevertheless perceive that the naming that occurs in myth is a necessary prerequisite for conceptualization. One might even say that it is in itself the birth of conceptualizing. The question still remains, however, as to how we get to naming, that great leap that Usner was puzzled by. But this is why Cassirer sees this indissoluble connection between myth and language, and why the investigation of myth can help us to comprehend language, because myth is where we find that leap, that bridging, the act of naming that represents the move from what might be spontaneous auditory expression to general concepts. As Cassirer's theory, rooted in Usner's philological work, goes, the birth of myth is the birth of language, and vice versa. They are two shoots off of the same stem, as Cassirer said at the beginning. Now, Usner attempted to approach this question by studying how it is that the gods were named. It would seem that the designation of the names of gods is the particular type of naming that sparks off this process. But this is not a purely speculative logical question. This is an anthropological question, and that's, of course, how Usner, being a philologist, approaches it. He designates three principal phases of divine nomenclature. These are the momentary gods, the special gods, and the personal gods. As we will discuss a bit later, on either side of these three phases are sort of like the originary conception of the divine prior to any of those three, and then monotheism, which characterizes most modern-day religiosity, is on the sort of the other side after all of these three phases. And those don't come from Usner. Cassirer is drawing from other work to come up with that whole framing. This original form of myth and its conclusion in monotheism do bear some apparent similarities with one another, as we will see, but these similarities are mostly superficial for Cassirer. A substantial transformation occurs over the course of this process. So first we'll look at the momentary God, quote, instantaneous, a fleeting, emerging, and vanishing mental content, end quote. Usner found traces of the momentary gods within the religions of the Greeks and Romans. But that wasn't the first place he went to look, or rather, that's not where he really clued into this idea. That was something he discovered later. He said he didn't really perceive the momentary God until he had studied the Lithuanian form of paganism. And once he had done that, he came to believe that this was a universal phase of conceptualization of deity. In the words of Cassirer, there are astonishing parallels in the religions of Native Americans and African tribes. The momentary God is not a universal concept. It's not an enduring phenomenon. It's a startlingly localized and specific deity in both place and time. Quote, in stark uniqueness and singleness, it confronts us, not as part of some force which may manifest itself here, there, and everywhere, in various places and times, and for different persons, but as something that exists only here and now, in one indivisible moment of experience, and for only one subject whom it overwhelms and holds in thrall. End quote. As a very important example, Cassirer cites the work of Jacob Spieth on the Eva tribe. And I am going to just read this entire chunk of the text because I think without going through all the examples that he gives, the idea of what a momentary God is would be very difficult for us to grasp because we already have these ready-made ideas of divinity from Christianity, even from polytheistic systems as we are familiar with them. None of those prepare us to understand this way of conceptualizing a deity. And so he talks about the concept of the tro, which is a name for a momentary god in the Eva tribe. Spieth writes, quote, "After the inhabitants of the town Zake and Peki had settled at that place, a certain farmer at work in his fields went to look for water. In a rough-shaped hollow, he drove his machete into the damp soil. Suddenly a gory-looking stream welled up before him, of which he drank, and which he found refreshing. He told his family about it and persuaded them to come with him and worship that red fluid. After a while, the water cleared, and all the family drank of it. From this time on, this water was a tro to its discoverer and to his kin. It is said that upon the arrival of the first settlers of Anvelo, a man happened to be standing before a great, thick breadfruit tree. At the sight of the tree, he felt panicky. He went to the priest to ask for an explanation of this event. The answer he received was that the tree was a tro, which wanted to live with him and be worshipped by him. So his fright was the sign whereby the man knew that a tro had revealed itself to him. If anyone takes refuge in an anthill from his human or animal persecutors, he will say afterwards, 'The anthill saved my life.' It is the same when a man finds safety in a brook from some raging wounded animal, or a family or entire clan takes shelter from the enemy in some mountain fastness. In every case, the rescue is ascribed to some indwelling power of the object or place where or by means of which it occurred." End quote. So the tro is an incredibly fascinating idea that exemplifies the momentary God concept. One of the problems in trying to understand the genesis of language, as Cassirer lays it out here, and in his essay on man, is the problem of determining why a particular quality is noticed and what threshold of attentiveness is needed in order for that quality to be assigned a name. Because that would seem to be one of the aspects of this leap over into the naming activity. It's a very abstract way of putting the problem, but I think we can rephrase it in this way. If a name indicates a meaning that can stand aside from the individual instantiation of the symbol and cover a general class of objects, whatever that general class may be, it will be based on some quality or trait of the thing named, which all of the objects within that class possess, which is why they are so named. The reason why so many of these imperial gods of powerful empires have so many names is because they are assigned so many qualities. Obviously, you can't contain every single quality that a thing has within the name you give it, and thus when we look to the various languages of the world, the meaning behind the names they give things will point out different qualities of the thing. For example, see this passage in Essay on Man, quote, "As Humboldt pointed out, the Greek and Latin terms for the moon, although they refer to the same object, do not express the same intention or concept. The Greek term, min, denotes the function of the moon, to measure time. The Latin term, luna, denotes the moon's lucidity or brightness. Thus, we have obviously isolated and focused attention on two very different features of the object. The function of a name is always limited to emphasizing a particular aspect of a thing, and it is precisely this restriction and limitation upon which the value of the name depends. It is not the function of a name to refer exhaustively to a concrete situation, but merely to single out and dwell upon a single aspect. The isolation of this aspect is not a negative, but a positive act. For in the act of denomination, we select, out of the multiplicity and diffusion of our sense data, certain fixed centers of perception." End quote. And I just think that's a brilliant passage, right? So the name, we may say, it draws its attention to one feature or another. it can't exhaust everything about the real object, so to speak. It can't draw our attention to all its qualities. I mean, even if it could, is that really the function of the name? No, that's not how we use names. But besides this provides something incredibly useful, because if our attention, could go in every direction at once, perhaps we wouldn't need names. It's the overflowing possibilities for what we could focus our attention on at a given moment that makes it a positive act to designate one thing, one quality or aspect that's worthy of our attention and focus on it. And it's only by this means that we are able to perceive at all. It's by cutting away all the useless sense data, all that's not part of the unity of the concept, that we create this positive act. There's a reversal from the negative to positive, right? Because we are excluding, but by excluding, you're bringing your attention to something fully that you are then able to see. And further from there, later on, to identify, to abstract, to take it away from the specific instance. Cassirer writes in Language and Myth, quote, "Our problem is not the choice of properties already given, but the positing of the properties themselves. It is to comprehend and illuminate the nature and direction of noticing, which must precede mentally the function of denoting." End quote. So before we can denote something, before the word can stand for something, we have to notice that something. Seems rather obvious, like a rather obvious point to make, and yet we're trying to work backward and sort of reconstruct how it is that we would first be able to accomplish this act of naming. In the essay on man, Cassirer considers, alongside two other theories, the interjectionary theory of language, which we've already kind of touched on, the idea that language emerges as a kind of emotional interjection of sound at a certain experience. This framework will be very helpful for us, even though Cassirer thinks that it is ultimately incomplete. Because what is required to make this view of language useful is precisely what we are looking for in the momentary God, a theory of the name as an exclamation assigned to a specific quality, attribute, or event which demands our attention. And if we consider the examples that Spieth gave, we can see the high threshold for attentiveness required in order to create the concept. The momentary God is perceived, and more importantly named, because it seems to be an object or occurrence that, for example, saves your life. So it's an object or a place or an event, this deity, right, if we're looking at it as a tro, as a momentary deity, that has power over your life, therefore. So an object that saves your life, or that provides water or nourishment, or simply an object around which you have strange and unexplained feelings, that's the kind of captivation of attention that we're referring to. And what we're really trying to get at here is what Cassirer will call the condensation of attention. Attention is condensed almost into a single point in the form of this miraculous object or phenomenon. And that focus, reaching a single point, zeroes in on one single attribute. Perhaps in the case of the tro, it's the attribute of the thing that is responsible for saving your life. Perhaps in the case of naming the moon, who is, we'll remember, is always a god, right? We zero in on the attribute that we find to be most powerful, or the most useful, or the most auspicious, which will be different in every culture. And we can perhaps even use this understanding of the nomenclature of the momentary God to come to some potential understanding of the naming of even ordinary phenomena. Cassirer quotes Herder in his prize-winning essay on language, in which Herder imagines a person studying the form of the sheep, an animal for which he has as yet no name. And finally, the sheep bleats, and the person says to himself, "Ah, you are the bleating one." And so the bleating, the specific sound that's made by this animal, its distinctive sound, we might say its distinctive quality, that's what grabs his attention most strongly. And of course, Cassirer implies that the thing that's missing in Herder's theory is that he doesn't really account for noticing. In other words, he doesn't really explain noticing, but he gives us a description of how that faculty of noticing might work. And so to quote Spieth again, as Cassirer does, quote, "To the mind of the Eva, the moment in which an object or any striking attributes of it enter into any noticeable relation, pleasant or unpleasant, with the life and spirit of man, that moment a tro is born in his consciousness." End quote. Language is always an embodiment of life, and the suggestion here is that the birth of language occurs in the condensation of attention to the single point. This is brought on by encounters with phenomena of striking attributes who can affect the life and spirit of man. And here it is important to note, Cassirer argues that mythological thinking is very different from later uses for language, later developments in language, such as theorizing and conveying information as part of a logical analysis and so on, because theoretical thinking tries to relate the individual instance, the specific circumstance, to a particular object, and into a larger class or category. And so what theoretical thinking does is it takes the phenomena, the experience, and it breaks it out of its isolation, its narrow limits. It comprehends it as part of a definite order, we might say, an order of relations. Theoretical thinking takes things and compares and contrasts them to other things. So even though we may say that theoretical thinking involves honing our capacity for specificity, which may seem like we're zeroing in, and probably in a way that's much more rigorous than the specificity of thought involved in thinking about the momentary God. Nevertheless, all of that specificity is only comprehensible as part of a structure of knowledge that relates all things to everything else. Rationality understood in this way is sort of the opposite of condensing one's attention. One instead expands one's attention to the entire system as a way of understanding all of the individual elements in relation to it. That's what rationality does. By contrast, he describes someone under the spell of this mythic mode of thought in this passage, quote, "It is as though the whole world were simply annihilated. The immediate content, whatever it be, that commands his religious interest so completely fills his consciousness that nothing else can exist beside it and apart from it. The entire self is given up to a single impression, is, quote, possessed by it. External reality is not merely viewed and contemplated, but overcomes a man in sheer immediacy with emotions of fear or hope, terror or wish fulfillment. Then the spark jumps somehow across. The tension finds release as the subjective excitement becomes objectified and confronts the mind as a god or daemon." End quote. So we still haven't gotten to the next two phases of mythological naming. But we're dwelling on this because this is really the heart of the essay, in my view, that finally starts us on the road to understand how the specific instance can come to signify the general concept. It begins with that experience of being possessed, overwhelmed, given over to a single impression. It begins with the destruction of the whole chaotic world of potential sense impressions and the apparent presence of solely one thing, one object, one being, one presence dominating. And in this state of possession, man gives discharge to his tension. The heightened, perhaps almost unbearable and incomprehensible emotions that fill you when you're in the presence of a god. The god or spirit is given a name. And with this, the spark has jumped across. Emotion has been discharged into an auditory sign form, a word. And thus the inner state of condensation achieves an objectified form in itself. It creates at least the possibility for a conceptual object that can be conceived, that endures beyond the initial emotional impressions. Cassirer writes, quote, "It is here, in this intuitive creative form of myth, and not in the formation of our discursive theoretical concepts, that we must look for the key which may unlock for us the secrets of the original conceptions of language." End quote. Now, remember, Cassirer is ultimately arguing that language and myth come from the same source, the same root, the same stem. But he said that mythical thinking is totally antithetical to the unity sought by the rational intellect, which we must admit is a form of thought developed by language and within language. So that means he will have to account for why the origin of language is so different from its function. How do we arrive at our modern uses of language, which are self-evidently so different from this way of thinking? It takes quite a bit of work to even understand the perspective that could give rise to the momentary gods because it's so foreign from our own. We must somehow avoid, quote, the vicious circle into which the theory of logical expression is ever lapsing, end quote. So, for example, Cassirer quotes Hamann's famous saying that poetry is the mother tongue of humanity, which Cassirer interprets as a generally correct intuition, given all of these things that we've said, that the primitive power of subjective feeling is where we should look. That's where we should seek the bleeding edge of language, not in the objective or theoretical view of things. But again, that view can't get us all the way there, because the question remains then as to how the expressive nature of language eventually gives birth to the objective or the denotative. And for Cassirer, Hamann's theory, quote, cannot bridge the gulf between the purely denotative and the expressive function of speech, end quote. Usener's momentary gods and the way in which mankind develops into the next phase of deification would seem to provide an answer. And what I'm about to read is one of the most important passages in the entirety of myth and language, in my opinion. Quote, if such a god is, in his origin, the creation of a moment, if he owes his existence to some entirely concrete and individual, never-recurring situation, he yet achieves a certain substantiality which lifts him far above this accidental condition of his origin. Once he has become divorced from the immediate exigency, the fear or hope of the moment, he becomes an independent being, which henceforth lives on by a law of its own, and has gained form and continuity. He appears to men not as a creature of the hour, but as an objective and superior power which they adore, and which their cult endows with more and more definite form. The image of the momentary god, instead of merely preserving the memory of what he originally meant and was, persists and remains long after that memory has faded. The same function which the image of a god performs, the same tendency to permanent existence, may be ascribed to the uttered sounds of language. The word, like a god or a daimon, confronts man not as a creation of his own, but as something existent and significant in its own right, as an objective reality. As soon as the spark has jumped across, as soon as the tension and emotion of the moment has found its discharge in the word or the mythical image, a sort of turning point has occurred in human mentality. The inner excitement, which was a mere subjective state, has vanished and has been resolved into the objective form of myth and speech. And now an ever-progressive objectification can begin. In the same measure in which the autonomous activity of man extends over a widening sphere and becomes adjusted and organized within that sphere, his mythical and verbal world undergoes a progressive organization and ever more definite articulation. The momentary gods are succeeded by gods of activity. End quote. So it is this emotional excitation that condenses the entire world down to a single thing, a single quality, that is the impetus for the symbolic activity in language. That's where the symbol is made. But once this excitation is discharged in the form of a name or an image, the thing becomes an object, or it becomes perceived as an object, as something external. The symbol does not necessarily carry with it the emotional content that produced the initial excitation. And we might say that, it doesn't necessarily carry with it, but that over time, it's necessarily going to be deprived of its emotional content or debased of it, like the way coinage is debased. Because emotions are instantaneous and fleeting, so now it's no longer the fleeting experience of the moment. The quality that it designates can now appear as a kind of independent fact. And hereafter, that's where this progressive objectification can occur. And the exact same statements in this respect can be made about gods as about words. As we've already seen, there is that connection between mythology and language in the god as the one who names, who gives names or gives man the ability to name, the power to name, and the name of the god as representing the power or qualities of the god. And so we'll now go through these subsequent phases. Usener says, as we mentioned, that the traces of the momentary gods endure even in the classical period of Hellenic Greece, sort of like the traces or echoes of the momentary gods. He writes, quote, "Any idea or object which commands, for the moment, their undivided interest, may be exalted to divine status. Reason and understanding, wealth, chance, climax, wine, feasting, or the body of the beloved. Whatever comes to us suddenly, like a sending from heaven, whatever rejoices or grieves or oppresses us, seems to the religious consciousness like a divine being. As far as we can trace the Greeks, they subsume such experiences under the generic term of daimon." End quote. So the Greek daimones for Usener are the traces of the momentary gods. And the Greek concept of the demonic, that's another topic which we've already covered actually this season, if you want to go back and look at the demonic series, discussing Goethe's use of the term, discussing a little bit the ancient Greeks. I also had a conversation with Gnostic Informant about this, so all of that content is there if you want to look into that further and you haven't already. But as these gods are named, and the name suggests then to the human mind a kind of independent existence, separate from the emotional excitation that birthed the name, that's where we start to move on to these gods of activity, the special gods, also known as the functional gods. Both terms are used, but primarily special gods is how we're going to refer to them. These gods and the names for them reflect or embody the form of life of mankind, which expands into all sorts of domains of activity as man's knowledge and technology progresses. And so the next phase of deification occurs not as a spontaneous event, but as part of an attempt to name repeated and recurring activities and events that become apparent within the knowledge of mankind as something that will recur, like changing of the seasons and things like this. Cassirer writes, quote, "Man ceases to be a mere shuttlecock at the mercy of outward impressions and influences. This course now has its own measure and periodicity, at definite intervals, in uniform cycles from day to day and month to month. Human activities repeat themselves and are linked with invariant permanent effects. These deities, which Usener calls the special gods, have as yet no general function and significance. They do not permeate existence in its whole depth and scope, but are limited to a mere section of it. But within their respective spheres, they have attained to permanence and definite character. The patron god of harrowing, for instance, the god Okator, rules not only this year's harrowing or the cultivation of a particular field, but is the god of harrowing in general, who is annually invoked by the whole community as its helper and protector upon the recurrence of this agricultural practice." End quote. When these special gods are conceived, they are given a special name, and these names denote the activity which the god presides over. We may notice that the special god, or the functional god, remains limited in its existence, but the shift of the greatest importance here is the permanence of this phase, the fact that the same deity is invoked with regularity and with recurrence. Cassirer does not speak much about this, but I would imagine that with the development of astrology and the attempts to understand the seasons and develop calendars and so on, that this social development would go hand in hand with the idea of a deity that is recurring or permanent in some sense. Unlike these individual daimones that seem to spring into existence and then out of it again, the special god, the god over some specialization of human activity, always returns, so long as the activity is embodied in the life of the culture and we continually repeat that activity. The third and final phase is the birth of the personal god. Usener sees personal gods coming into being through the name for the special god, coming to mean something other than simply the narrow activity that it originally designated, through accidents of, quote, phonetic changes or the obsolescence of its verbal root, end quote. And that relates us back to what Max Muller talked about with sort of the shifts and the relation between the word Daphne and the word Ahana, the Greek and the Sanskrit root. As we mentioned, Cassirer takes issue with Muller's conclusions in this respect, but the etymology is solid, right? So then Usener continues, quote, "Then the name no longer suggests to those who use it the idea of a single activity, the word has become a proper name, and this connotes, just like the given name of a man, the conception of a personality. Thus, a new being has been produced, which continues to develop by a law of its own. The concept of the special God, which expressed a certain activity rather than a certain nature, now achieves its embodiment and appears, so to speak, in the flesh. This God is now capable of acting and suffering like a human creature. He engages in all sorts of actions, and instead of being wholly consummated in one function, he is related to it as an independent subject. The many divine names, which originally denoted a corresponding number of sharply distinguished special gods, now fuse into one personality which has thus emerged." End quote. And so we go from the momentary instance to the repeated experience, to finally the idea of the word as designating a nature, something which expands beyond all of these narrow limits. In the case of gods, a personality. In the case of words, we might say a kind of conceptual essence or something like this. And so there's an interweaving and interlocking relationship between language and myth, as we have seen, so much so that Cassirer is content to say that it is impossible that such a tight relation between the development of these two different human activities could be attributable to mere chance. What is significant to Cassirer is not simply that language and myth have shared a common evolution, but that the same conditions, quote, govern both verbal expression and mythic imagination from their earliest unconscious beginnings, end quote. This is where the chapter on word magic becomes rather important. Word magic is a deep-rooted aspect of mythic thinking. And while we may not refer to it as magic in the present day, the idea that calling on the name of a deity could be a form of protection is definitely a belief held by many in the present day. Christians believe this. Many people of many religions believe this, right? So it's not something that's disappeared in modernity. And Cassirer doesn't mention this example, but one that comes to mind for me is that in Chinese Buddhism, it is said that calling on the protection of Kuan Yin, merely even uttering her name, is enough to compel the bodhisattva to save you from any danger, because her compassion for all sentient beings is simply that great. Or consider, again, to go back to a Western example, Matthew 18:20, quote, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them," end quote. So whenever an assembly invokes the name of Christ, whenever there are those who invoke the name of Christ gathered together, Christ is literally present at that assembly. A common Christian expression, "in God's name," or when a Muslim says, "in the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful," there's the sense that yes, it is the power of God, but it's in some sense calling upon the name of God. The word itself has some sort of power. These are not new concepts. These are not created by monotheism. They may, in fact, be an expression of one of the oldest forms of religiosity known to man, that of word magic. Cassirer quotes Albrecht Dietrich, who writes, quote, "The name functions as a proxy for its bearer, and to speak the name may be equal to calling a person into being. A name is feared because it is a real power," end quote. And once again, I would bring to mind the many myths, especially from ancient Egyptian mythology, about learning the deity's true name in order to bind him or compel him. And Cassirer argues the special gods, the functional gods, also required this kind of word magic in order to invoke them. While he dwells only within a particular domain, which is also where his name assigns him or designates his place, so to speak, quote, "Whoever would be assured of his protection and aid must be sure to enter his realm, i.e., to call him by his right name." This need explains the phraseology of prayer and of religious speech in general, both in Greece and in Rome. All the turns of phrase which ring a change on the several names of the god in order to obviate the danger of missing the proper and essential appellation. In Rome, it produced a standing formula in which the various terms of invocation, corresponding to the several aspects of the god's nature and will, are disjointed by either or, sive, end quote. How are we to understand word magic as the relation between myth and language? Again, this may be difficult because of the theoretical style of thought that represents the typical use of language today, though not by any means the only use, but which dominates the way we implicitly think about language. Theoretical thinking, once again, it expands our focus, relating concepts to one another. The sign becomes a vessel of exchangeable meaning, which is useful because of the relations it establishes. Even our inquiry here, theoretical as it is focused on understanding this relation between myth and language. And so we must go back to the momentary gods where this whole process really begins. Cassirer repeats that this free ideality, as he calls it, is totally absent from the mythic forms of thought that birthed language. The free ideality, as he calls it, is part of the modern theoretical use of language, not the original forms. Quote, here thought does not confront its data in an attitude of free contemplation, seeking to understand their structure of their systematic connections and analyzing them according to their parts and functions, but is simply captivated by a total impression. Only when this intense individuation has been consummated, when the immediate intuition has been focused and, one might say, reduced to a single point, does the mythic or linguistic form emerge, and the word or the momentary God is created. End quote. It's in that mindset that we can comprehend the what we might call the reasoning behind word magic. Word magic comes out of this experience of total condensation, this interpretation of the world that can only occur when one is possessed by a totalizing phenomenon that devours his attention, leaving nothing else of the so-called external world. This is an experience in which a mere presence can become the sum of all being. This means, quote, the conscious experience is not merely wedded to the word, but is consumed by it. Whatever has been fixed by a name, henceforth is not only real, but is reality. We find a relation of identity, of complete congruence between image and object, between name and thing, end quote. And we've touched on this notion before, but it's through this understanding that Cassirer explains certain religious rituals or magical rituals in which, for example, one might pour out water in order to provoke rain. For within this mythological mindset, water everywhere is sort of one deity, and by compelling it to fall, by spilling droplets of water in a certain place, the rain will naturally follow. Carl Jung also wrote at length about this, especially in his work on alchemy and these correspondence theories, right, that give rise to alchemy. So, for example, fire is red, so the color red is fire, right? It is to the unconscious literally the same. It's of one symbolic substance, we might say. And so this is the magical mindset. The image is what it represents. And by manipulating the image, you therefore manipulate reality. There is no distinction to be made there. Similarly with the word is the deity. By calling on the deity's name, you summon him there literally. And if you'll remember, the way deities are named is by noticing and denoting their main striking quality. That quality, that trait, that attribute, that virtue, or we might say that particular power of the deity, that's what's summoned by the word. And thus we have certain beliefs such as these, quote, according to the Kora Indians and the Uitoto, the patriarch created men and nature, but that since this creation he no longer interferes directly with the course of events. In lieu of such personal intervention, he gave to men his words, i.e. his cult and the religious ceremonies by means of which they now control nature and attain whatever is necessary for the welfare and perpetuation of the race. Without these holy spells, which were originally given into their keeping, men would be entirely helpless, for nature yields nothing merely in return for human labor. Among the Cherokees, too, it is an accepted belief that success in hunting or fishing is due chiefly to the use of certain words, of the proper magic formulae. End quote. It was a very long road of development indeed, from understanding the word as a kind of physical magical power, which summons or invokes a particular spirit or god, to reach the understanding of the word as a kind of spiritual power. The conception of the word we receive in the book of John, for instance, or even in the work of Heraclitus, in which the flux of the world is organized by the logos, the principle according to which the flux proceeds. But what is revealed to man over the course of this development is that world which Cassirer says we discover as standing closer to us than a world of so-called objects. And that is the symbolic world. And it's only within the progressive objectification made possible in that symbolic world that we can eventually develop something like discursive, theoretical uses of language. Before we can come to the final point and the concluding ideas of the episode, I mentioned earlier that these three phases stand between a kind of originary starting conception and our modern conceptions of the divine, which are monotheistic. Cassirer does not get this from Usner, but from an English missionary named Codrington, who wrote about 30 years after Usner's work and studied the Melanesian religion. And what he discovers is something prior even to the momentary gods, and this is what is referred to as the mana-taboo complex, sort of in general terms. There's all sorts of different words that are used for this according to the culture. But essentially, in many tribal societies, we find these ideas of a kind of indeterminate divinity that manifests in individual things and events. And upon originally encountering these beliefs, Cassirer argues that Westerners tended to misunderstand them. So, for example, we have the word Mulungu in the Shambhala language, we have the word Wakanda in the Sioux language, and the term Manitou of the Algonquins. Sometimes these concepts were rendered as being spirits, like referring to the concept of a spirit, or perhaps it was the name of the great spirit who takes many forms, or perhaps a mythical field of force or something like this. The problem with these renderings is that it misunderstands how these words are used in the language games of these tribes, which the most various uses for these words. Soderblom writes, quote, "The words in question, mana, Manitou, Orinda, etc., have ambivalent meaning and are variously translated as remarkable, very strong, very great, very old, strong in magic, wise, supernatural, divine, or in a substantive sense as power, magic, sorcery, fortune, success, godhead, delight." End quote. We can see then that these words can mean so many things and seemingly take the form of both an adjective or a verb, that it may be difficult to understand the common identity between these terms. What might that be? Cassirer says that the difficulty is caused by the fact that we are moving in conceptual territory in which the divine has not yet been attributed a fixed form, we might say. So the issue is that these terms don't have a definite meaning. They do not so much designate a specific thing as they do a general sense of something, anything, as being numinous, we might say. Oftentimes it is whatever has power. So the Sioux do not speak of the Wakanda as if it's a spirit, but rather might say that an auspicious event like a bountiful harvest or, again, an object or something auspicious that saves your life, that is Wakanda, right? A wise man who is suspected of having power like a shaman might be called Wakanda. Lightning and thunder could be called Wakanda, as well as the stars, the wind, the cedar. The term also referred to mythical creatures or to religious totems and ceremonies. It was used, quote, indiscriminately as substantive and adjective, and with slight modification as verb and adverb, end quote. So it's not a spirit. It's not even really a thing. It's a quality, but it's not a specific quality. And hopefully, given the way we've talked about the quality as the thing which is noticed and then denoted about the God, you can see where we're going with this. It's a sort of indeterminate quality, we might say. Quote, "The Manitou of the Algonquins, the Mulungu of the Bantus, is used in this way, as an exclamation which indicates not so much a thing as a certain impression, and which is used to greet anything unusual, wonderful, marvelous, or terrifying." End quote. Of course, the similarity to the momentary gods is immediately perceptible. But we might ask then how the mana-taboo concept differs from the momentary deity. Well, we might say that this kind of linguistic term is the backdrop out of which the momentary God can emerge. So perhaps the Greeks first have a general conception of the daimonic as indicating anything marvelous or terrifying or powerful, but then they begin to speak of particular individual daimones. The reason why such a conception is the necessary backdrop for conceiving the momentary gods is that these terms, Mulungu, Manitou, Orinda, Wakanda, etc., make a conceptual division between the sacred and the profane. These words indicate what is sacred, what is thereby, by that same token, also taboo, and there's basically no distinction, by the way, between sacred and taboo, we might say. in this sort of indeterminate use of the term. They indicate things which must be feared and respected for their power, even if one thinks that in some instances what manifests as manna is generous or good-natured, it should still, in some sense, be attributed this reverence. I mean, and we carry this through to our modern conceptions of God as well, right? People call themselves God-fearing to this very day. As I mentioned before, this conception of a kind of divine quality that can manifest anywhere and in anything may suggest to us, with our modern ways of thinking, that it's actually that's rather similar to, say, the pantheism of Spinoza or the monism of certain ancient thinkers or religions. But Cassirer argues, quote, "The beginning and the end do not resemble each other, for we have progressed from a realm of mere indeterminateness to the realm of true generality," end quote. So there's a distinction to be made between generality and indeterminateness. Generality is what awaits us at the end of that process of discursive theoretical thinking, in which the particular is related to the general concept. All things are sort of constellated together as part of a system, right? And that's what monotheistic thinking, when it finally arrives, represents. The apogee of rational discursive thought, in a sense. The ability to proceed to general knowledge and categories. That produces this all-encompassing view of the divine or nature. But that's very different from this originary stage, in which nothing is determinate at all. In the monotheistic era, God as omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, that's the ground of being. And this does produce a kind of maybe superficial indeterminateness, and that language realizes the boundaries of its own abilities in trying to describe the divine. But Cassirer mentions the Christian mystics, for example. People like Eckhart, who see God as the groundless ground of being. Quote, "When the growth of language achieves the liberation of the concept of being from its bondage to some specific form of existence, it thereby furnishes mythico-religious thought with a new vehicle, a new intellectual tool. Critical or discursive thinking, it is true, finally progresses to a point at which the expression of being appears as the expression of a relation, so that, to speak with Kant, being is no longer a possible predicate of a thing, and therefore can no longer be an attribute of God. But for mythic thought, which recognizes no such critical distinctions, being is not only a predicate, but at a certain stage of development actually becomes the predicate of predicates. It becomes the expression which allows one to subsume all the attributes of God under a single rubric. Wherever in the history of religious thought the demand for the unity of the deity arises, it takes its stand on the linguistic expression of being and finds its surest support in the word." End quote. And so now, as a conclusion to this analysis of Cassirer's work, we'll look to his thoughts in the final chapter on the power of metaphor. In a way, this is the elusive prey that we have been chasing throughout this entire inquiry, in the way that Socrates says the sophist is the most elusive prey, right? That's been our prey that we've been hunting. Cassirer argues that when we say myth and language spring from the same root, that root is metaphor. This is the form of mental operation that is at work in both myth and language, and through understanding metaphor, not just simply saying that that's the link or the origin of language, but by understanding how it works, which I hope we've done, I hope we've fleshed that out, we can see the unity between myth and language in that, as well as the ways in which they differ and necessarily eventually must split off from one another. There have been many theories on the way that metaphor connects language and myth, as we mentioned briefly in this episode, and Cassirer says, before we can adjudicate this dispute, we have to understand the operations of metaphor itself. It's impossible to understand metaphor without understanding that magical view of the world, the backdrop of name and word taboos, the religious mores shaped by the idea of word magic. The problem with the many interpretations of how metaphorical transference comes to arise is that they pose it in so many words as a chicken and egg question. Which came first, metaphorical thinking or myth? And Cassirer's argument is that this is a specious question, as he calls it, because the two are functionally identical. Where we should seek the answer is in that experience of intensification, that spiritual excitement that furnishes, in Usener's words, quote, both the occasion and the means of its denomination, end quote. In this intensification, against that pre-existent backdrop, the conceptual framework in which the sacred and profane are distinguished and identified, the name is given. And when we understand the thinking behind word magic, the answer becomes clear. Quote, the part does not merely represent the whole or the specimen its class. They are identical with the totality to which they belong, not merely as mediating aids to reflective thought, but as genuine presences which actually contain the power, significance, and efficacy of the whole. Here one is reminded forcefully of the principle which might be called the basic principle of verbal as well as mythic metaphor, the principle of pars pro toto. End quote. That phrase, of course, means the part is the whole. This is how we are to understand not just metaphor in the sense of a word that invokes an image standing for a concept, or a word, an image conveyed through words standing for some other word or some other concept, but what Cassirer calls the radical metaphor, that original leap that has to be made, transferring the experience to a sound or syllable. Quote, most of what is known as magic of analogy springs from the same fundamental attitude, and the very nature of this magic shows that the concept in question is not one of mere analogy, but of a real identification. End quote. And so at the basis of all of our theoretical discursive use of language that we get so much use out of today for things like long-winded philosophical analysis and that type of thinking that we all love, or I assume you love if you're listening to this podcast. But it's magical thinking that's at the base of that. The real identification of the sound with what it signifies as its name. The name is the thing. That's the totally irrational, experiential, emotional sense that creates the momentary God. It's also the basis of all of our abstract thinking, because we need that condensation of attention, that intensification that emerges out of that spiritual excitement that consumes the whole world. It's in that context, it's within that magical experience that a sound complex can actually not just signify a thing, but take the first step before it can even signify the thing. It has to become the thing. That's how the chasm is leapt over, and we begin to symbolize. And it's only through a long process after that, of the de-emotionalization of the words, the de-intensification, that objectification can happen, that the word can take on its own existence. It can now be received, as we get our words today, we receive them ready-made. We now experience them as though they were their own objects, their own existences, so to speak. And that we can now, with the cooling and hardening of that emotional excitation, we can begin to treat these words as concepts and begin to expand our focus from the soul experience into a generalized understanding of reality in which all the concepts are related. So not just metaphor, but magic, myth, is at the basis of all rational thinking, which becomes possible with the development of more complex linguistic forms. It is precisely because we're not bound to the wealth and fullness of immediate experience, which was once seen as substantially identical with the word, that language can now become a vehicle of thought. Quote, word and mythic image, which once confronted the human mind as hard realistic powers, have now cast off all reality and effectuality. They have become a light, bright ether in which the spirit can move without let or hindrance. This liberation is achieved not because the mind throws aside the sensuous forms of word and image, but in that it uses them both as organs of its own, and thereby recognizes them for what they really are, forms of its own self-revelation. End quote. And that is the lovely ending of Language and Myth by Ernst Cassirer. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into his thoughts on language. Join me again next week, where I'm going to attempt, as I said, a synthesis. We're going to be talking about Nietzsche's theories on language, Cassirer's theories on language, and Wittgenstein's, and try and combine them into some sort of sensible theory that partakes of all three. So join me then, if that sounds interesting. Hope I've been able to shine a light on this underrated philosopher. Cheers, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.